Okay, we're gonna get started today, everyone. Laura isn't here to introduce our speaker, so I should pass up with that. So today we have Adam Rosenfield, who is a graduate of the University of Toronto in 2015 in engineering science, and then went on and did his master's at MIT, and you're now on the NOM. Well, I'm doing better than I expected. Remembering details. Okay, well that's great. So let's all welcome Adam. Look forward to an exciting stuff.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here after a few years away, and be back here in Canada and in Toronto and in the ITS lab, these hallowed halls. So my first foray into this whole world was almost a decade ago when I was attending a lecture by this professor named Eric Miller, and he was talking about something called UT-ITE, and I didn't really know much about what it was, but I remember going to talk to him right after the lecture and asking him what he was working on, and got to end up working with him that summer, and lo and behold, I ended up falling in love with his discipline, and about a decade later, it's so cool to be back here, and it's amazing how to think that one lecture really changed the course of my professional life. So, no such expectations for this lecture, but I hope to be talking about some interesting things that I did in my grad research when I went off to MIT to do a double master's in city planning and transportation. So I was looking at the combination of engineering and transportation, but also public policy, a bit of psychology and politics all into the mix, because that's really how we end up with the transportation systems that we have. And so today I want to talk a bit about my research, and I'll first introduce a little bit about what our lab did at MIT. But first, so everyone says at the beginning of their talks, transportation is at a crossroads today, and they always show a picture of crossroads, but I'm more of a transit guy, so I'll show train tracks crossing. And we're at a point now where the future is quite uncertain. There's a lot of hype, as I was just chatting with Eric Miller about, around technology and the prospect of things like autonomy and connected vehicles and all these sorts of things to improve our transportation systems and improve our cities. But in all this, there's a few things that stay constant, and that is really the human side, is that our psychology, our behavior as individuals and as institutions is very slow to change, and often won't change at all in terms of the fundamentals of how we behave. And so it's really important to look at the intersection between transportation policy, technology, and human behavior. So that's what my lab did at MIT with Professor Jinhua Zhao in the Faculty of Urban Planning. And so his lab looks at the intersection of those things, and it looks to shape travel behavior, design mobility systems, and improve transportation policies with an understanding of behavioral science. So I'll talk a little bit about these three things just to motivate the talk. First on behavior. So has anyone read any of these three books? Predictably Rational, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nudge? Yeah. So I recommend these just regardless of what discipline you're in. They're really interesting thought pieces on how human irrationality pervades the way we make decisions as society. And it really helped frame the way that our transportation systems get developed in our cities in an interesting way. So one example, we'll talk about money. So my professor likes to talk about the difference between the dollar and the perceived dollar. So the real dollar, and I'm sorry that the screen's a little small, but the real dollar is important for things like revenue and costs when it comes to policy making. But the perceived dollar is what matters when it comes to things like behavior change and public acceptance of policy. And that gap between them is what we call salience. So how much you notice or feel the money being spent or being earned. And so this is important when we talk about things like congestion charging, gas taxes, parking charges, as I'll talk about later in the talk. And so that's one really important aspect that I think is useful to think about in transportation, because it also applies equally to the concepts of time, the perceived minute compared to the actual minute, and how that can influence policy decisions as well. On the policy front, we talk about salience when it comes to, say, road tolls, for example. Many of us are familiar with Highway 407. This is a great example of a case where you have low salience because the tolls, you don't really notice them. And so it's good for revenue generation, not so good for behavior change if you're trying to discourage driving. On the opposite end of the spectrum, something like this is great for making you notice how much you're paying. You literally have to take a paper dollar if you're in the States, which is where this photo was taken, and give it to someone, and you feel that cost and that burden. So it's really interesting that here you'll have perhaps less revenue because people will not want to take it as much, but more of a power for behavior change. And in our lab, we also do a lot of research on urban development in China. And so we were looking at the auction versus lottery processes that happen in Shanghai and in Beijing when it comes to getting licenses to drive your car. And so here it's a fascinating case study of how you can use these different tools to try and discourage automobile ownership, but once you have your car, you really want to use it because you've paid all this money to get a license, or you were lucky in this lottery. And finally, on technology, as I mentioned, everyone is asking this question: how will the connected and autonomous vehicle reshape our cities? And so, in my company where I work at now, Autonomic, we're a subsidiary of Ford Smart Mobility, and we're focused on the connected vehicle side of things. And if you're interested in that, come talk to me after. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to try and lean more on the behavior and policy side. And so I'll jump right into my thesis. So what I was looking at is how can the workplace be a tool for transportation behavior change when it comes to trying to encourage sustainable commuting practices, encourage alternatives to single occupant commuting, encourage things like public transit, active transportation, and how can we also, in a broader sense, reshape our cities away from building too much parking than we need, and convert those uses to better things. So I was looking particularly at things like employee commuter benefits, things like parking provision and the pricing of that. And on the behavioral science side, things like nudging and gamification. So I was really looking at 4 key stakeholders in this research. I was looking at the commuter and the things that a commuter is trying to optimize in their daily decision. And things like habit that might lead to inertia even when there's a better mode or behavior that's possible. I look at the employer, who at the end of the day is not in the transportation business. What they're trying to do is make sure that their employees are happy and most of all productive. And so they want to attract and retain employees, and they're not going to be too interested in doing anything fancy or too extreme when it comes to commuting benefits. But if we can make a case that it makes sense for their bottom line, employers listen. From the transit agency perspective, we had a close working relationship with the MBTA in Boston, and we're discussing with them what they can do from the perspective of transit benefits, things like monthly corporate passes to encourage behavior change. And lastly, society at large, that's trying to reduce the negative externalities associated with transportation, congestion, pollution, and the like. So the objectives in my research were kind of threefold. One was to evaluate the impact of a set of reforms that we implemented at MIT for all their faculty and staff in order to encourage alternate modes of commuting. The second was to actually design some experiments. So building on that initial reform, we did some randomized controlled trials to see what other incentives could work to further shift behavior. And finally, the so what. So what can we do beyond MIT? How can we take this forward to other policymakers, institutions, transit agencies, and the public at large to show what works and what doesn't. So just a bit of a primer on the world of TDM, or Transportation Demand Management. This really came to the forefront in the 1970s. There were a few real shocks to the system in the name of oil crises. So people realized gasoline was getting expensive, and it made sense to do things like carpool. And so we saw carpool rates really shoot up, and they've been on a decline ever since. In the 80s and 90s, there were, and this is admittedly US focused, but there was the Clean Air Act that really changed the calculus in the US and expanded federal powers around transportation demand management, so employers actually had to take steps to reduce their drive-alone mode share. And today, there's more technology in that realm, and so we're able to do things like dynamic carpool matching, better management of commuter benefits at employers. But the world of TDM, I think, is still somewhat under-leveraged as a tool to shift behavior in a way that you can't do just by building more and more supply. So in terms of the approaches that are available to employers and to governments, this is from the Federal Highway Administration, just a set of different options that you can do if you're trying to shift mode share within a city or within an employer. Employers can typically focus on things like parking and management and pricing, transit incentives and the like, with a bit of things like car sharing and teleworking that can be implemented as well. But I'm going to focus on those first two. So really, going through my lit review, just a few things that really stuck out to me was around parking. So how many of you have heard of Donald Trump? Yeah. So Donald Shoup is a fascinating guy, and if you Google his name, S-H-O-U-P, I really suggest looking at his book. Don't read it because it's like this thick, but it's called The High Cost of Free Parking. And in it, he discusses the way our cities have been designed around excessive parking through zoning provisions that require developers to build more parking than we actually need. And from the employer perspective, it's interesting how that translates into costs that are borne for the employer and then onto the commuters themselves. So I found that parking was, no matter what you do in terms of transit benefits, things like bike to work day, carpool weeks, whatever, if you don't get the parking pricing right, nothing else matters. And so I found that to be an interesting takeaway, that 80% of the variation in drive-alone rates can be attributed to parking availability and pricing. But on the transit side, commuter benefits can be really impactful. I know we used to have a tax benefit here in Canada that was eliminated, but when employers offer these benefits, they have a large impact on behavior. And third, on carpooling, I mentioned briefly, it seems to be one of those like holy grails in transportation planning. Everyone's trying to do something on it, and yet rates seem to keep going down and down every single year. But if we can chip away at that for areas that have a lower transit accessibility, there's a lot of potential there. So just a brief context on the MIT campus. This was a photo from a few decades ago showing that much like many areas in Toronto and other large cities, it was a sea of parking. Parking lots in basically every open spot. Today, not so much. A lot of the space has been converted back to areas for people, green space, new buildings, and it's been really nice to see that transformation. And even just a few years ago, this lot was converted into a nice sort of park area in front of some of the buildings. But nevertheless, we still have a lot of parking on campus, and there's a parking crunch in recent years because lots like these have had to be tear down because they're at the end of their lifespan. And replacing these is extremely, extremely expensive. So just some numbers at a glance here. MIT's got 11,000 staff, so that's employees and faculty, 4,000 of whom can have a parking space on any given day. So it's a lot of parking spots, but still nowhere near enough for anyone that wants to drive. And the subsidy for these parking permits was at around 38%. If you bought a parking permit, MIT still subsidized part of that cost. And when it comes to the cost of actually building new spaces, I was blown away at some of the figures that I saw from the engineering estimates of what it costs to build new underground parking in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Because we're by the Charles River waterbed and the engineering complexities of it, these spaces were quoted at around $100,000 to $200,000 each. So clearly, employers are looking at this as huge capital investments that they have to make. And in areas like Cambridge, where the zoning laws require that new parking be built underground, otherwise it impacts your floor area ratio and all sorts of zoning speak that's really important to planners. These numbers really tell an interesting and powerful story. So MIT was clearly motivated to make a change and to reduce their drive-alone mode share. And so we developed a program called Access MIT that was a vision to provide MIT commuters with flexible, affordable, and sustainable or low-carbon mobility options. And it really had two key components to it. The first was a shift in parking policies. So it was a shift to daily parking pricing instead of annual or monthly fees. The idea being that when you unlock that sort of monthly or annual sunk cost, so you pay for your parking permit and then you feel the need to get your money's worth out of it, and then you have your day-to-day flexibility to pay for parking one day and not the next. It's pretty simple stuff, but it has a huge behavioral effect. So what we did is we charged every employee $10 a day that they parked on campus. And so it used to be $1,760 for an annual permit. Instead, it became $10 a day. But to not penalize the drivers who had to drive every day for various reasons, we capped it, that $10 a day price, at the old price of an annual permit. So you pay $10 a day until you hit that cap, and then it would be free for the rest of the year. So nobody could ever come out worse than they were before. And yet it was fascinating to see people complaining about this, because they said, oh, but it feels like it costs more, because I'm paying every time. And it was when you tapped your ID card on the gate, so it wasn't actually handing out cash. It was very seamless, and it came off your paycheck if you were doing a direct deposit kind of thing. But still, people were like, oh, this billing seems more noticeable. And me hearing that as a researcher, I'm like, yeah, that's the point. So that was really interesting to see. But we didn't want to just penalize people. We wanted carrots and sticks. And the real carrot here was on the transit side. So we provided every employee on their MIT employee ID card with a free transit pass. And you might be thinking, wow, that sounds really expensive. How did you do that? Well, one of the tricks was we only paid for trips that were actually taken. So instead of buying everyone a Metro Pass, or whatever they're called now, we told the employees that they were a monthly pass, but we had an arrangement with the MBTA, the transit agency there, where we were only billed for trips that were actually taken. That way you could provide a pass for all the drivers who were never going to actually use it much, but they then have that option to use it, but it doesn't bankrupt MIT. So that was an interesting pilot arrangement that we had with the transit agency that they're now looking to expand to other employers. And so we had a few other benefits that we implemented. We increased the subsidy for commuter rail monthly passes. We started subsidizing transit or parking at transit stations. So for people that aren't living on a transit route, they might feel kind of left out from the free transit pass benefit. And we wanted everyone to feel a part of this program. So we said, you know what, if you drive to the nearest transit station or the commuter rail station, we'll subsidize a decent part of your parking charges so that you can take transit for free or highly subsidized the rest of the way in. So it doesn't solve the parking problem, it sort of pushes it onto the transit agency, and they were not necessarily super thrilled about that because they've got their own capacity issues. But it certainly addresses congestion around the core of the city of Cambridge and helps people get into a transit-oriented mindset. And finally, we implemented an online commuter dashboard that it was with a company called Ride Amigos, and they do things like commuter incentive campaigns, gamification, points programs, and we did some cool stuff with that dashboard with them. And the way we evaluated the impacts of this were kind of threefold. One was through surveys, sort of tried and true way of getting consumer traveler preferences. And so we asked people, every 2 years we do the survey, and we have to get a 50% sample size by regulations from the city of Cambridge. So we had a really rich data set there. But we also wanted to look at the ground truth. So we actually looked at parking taps, so when you would tap your card in and out of the gate every day to get in the lot. We looked at transit usage, because the pass was on people's ID cards, we actually knew when they were using transit. And we had arrangements to sort of aggregate and anonymize that data for our analysis, and it was really helpful to square that with whatever the survey data showed. And then finally, sort of on the more qualitative side, engagement with key stakeholders. So this is politically very contentious to do something like this. The second you talk about parking, it becomes a very emotional issue for a lot of administrators. There's a lot of risk aversion. We plan for a worst case scenario where there may not be enough parking 50 years down the line. And to say that, you know what, it's okay to sort of strike a balance there is a really tough conversation to have. And so I got to sit on the committee for parking and transportation at MIT, where we were setting parking rates for the next year. And I got to listen to these conversations and see sort of how the sausage gets made in terms of parking and transit policies, which was fascinating. So lo and behold, let's talk about some results. So this was the before case. 2014, MIT had been around a 30% drive-alone mode share for the last decade or so, which was great when you compare to the Boston average. But there was still more that could be done. But what this shows is that we'd already gotten a lot of that low-hanging fruit of people that could take transit because MIT had already offered ample subsidies for transit in the past. But what we saw shortly after introducing the program is that drive-alone mode share dropped 5 percentage points down to 25%, with most of that taken up by new transit riders. In terms of parking, we saw about 8% drop in parking transactions in those next 2 years, and an impressive growth in transit ridership. About 24% increase in staff who were using the MBTA services on a regular basis, so at least 3 times a week. Well, what was interesting here is we saw kind of polarization of parking activity. So this is the number of days per week that you park, 1 to 0 to 5. And we saw that afterwards, after we implemented the program, the frequent parkers actually started parking a little more, and we saw the infrequent parkers park a little less. And one of the hypotheses there, and it sort of was corroborated in the survey data, was, you remember that annual cap I mentioned? So that kind of eliminates the behavioral incentive for people that kind of know they're going to be parking every day. And so it's not too much of a surprise that those people perhaps just parked even more because they knew they were not going to benefit from the policy anyway. So if I were to redesign this program from scratch, I think one of the things I would change is instead of doing an annual cap on these daily fees, I would do a monthly cap on those fees, so that even if you drive a lot in, say, frigid January, you still have a behavioral incentive to switch up your commuting in the months to follow. So it's sort of a lesson learned going forward. On the other side of that diagram, the people that were occasional parkers, we actually saw a lot of people not even renew their parking permits at all. So we still had permits in that you paid once a year a small administrative fee for your right to then pay per day. And it was interesting that we actually saw a 13% drop in permit sales after we implemented this program. So a lot of new transit riders, which was exciting. This was an answer from a survey question where we asked people if they changed their modes, what did they shift to? And if they kept the same mode in this diagram, it means that they had the same mode from year to year, but they added a new secondary mode. So there are still changes there. And so we saw, an ample shift from SOV, or single occupant vehicle, to transit. And of course, you're going to get in any year some churn, and so some people will go the other way from transit down to SOV. What was interesting, though, of course, first the first arrow is bigger than the second, which is good to see. What was interesting is this third arrow from active to transit. So these are people that said they used to walk or bike to work and are now riding the MBTA, which is great if it means that they can bike more often in the year and they're foregoing a car purchase or something. But it's one of those inefficiencies in the policy in that MIT is now paying for trips that aren't actually helping reduce SOV trips. But an interesting sort of side effect of this. So one other example I'll give around the actual impacts of this is that garage picture I showed you before, the one that we tore down, it was called West Garage. And when we closed that garage, we had to reassign parkers across campus. And what we saw is that actually 1 in 6 of those parkers, even though they were given a new spot, it was usually like a slightly fewer minute walk longer than where they were before. 1 in 6 of them stopped purchasing a permit altogether once we actually did this. And it kind of speaks to the impact of just a little nudge in getting you to think about your day-to-day behavior to affect an actual shift. In that we're all creatures of habit, and the second you're forced to think about the decisions you're making and look at the costs and benefits, we saw that a lot of people rethought their decision to be parking in these garages. And so the kicker, though, for the finance folks that are interested in how much this actually costs and benefits, this was really exciting. Everyone was concerned that it was going to cost MIT too much money, the MBTA was going to lose money because they were no longer getting monthly passes that commuters used to buy, so they all used to buy Metro passes like we do here, and now they all have this pass on their card. So there was a lot of concern here. But what we saw in the first couple of years is that MIT is coming out ahead. Because when you look at these, the capital savings over time, even with relatively conservative estimates of the cost to build parking, those costs outweigh the increased subsidy that MIT is putting into the transit benefits. So that was really exciting to see that it's actually coming out slightly ahead for them long term. Yes, it's costing a little more right now. It's about extra $2 million a year for transit subsidies. But when you look at capital expenditures, even though they're in separate buckets in people's finance books, it comes out ahead. On the transit side, revenue from the MBTA was estimated to grow about 5%. Yes, people that were used to buy monthly passes are now doing a pay-per-use kind of thing. But between more transit riders and people riding even more, you're actually getting an increase in ridership and revenue to the MBTA. So we'd say this is a qualified success. There's still more that can be done. Carpool rates have been declining still, and we're trying to get that going up as well. So there's some ideas on that front. But it was really exciting to see that initial positive result from this program. But I mentioned we also wanted to do some experiments and take this a little further as researchers. Because we implement this institute-wide, and from a policy perspective, it's great to kind of throw everything you've got at a problem and see what sticks. From a research perspective, that's not so great, because you don't know what's working and what's not. So what we actually did was we designed a randomized controlled trial to see what kind of incentives are going to affect people's behavior in a more rigorous way. So we said, let's try some of these nudges. So these sort of soft pushes to get people to think about shifting their commute. And so we tested whether a targeted information provision, so weekly commuter digest emails that we would send to all employees for a 6-week period, and a combination of that and or monetary rewards based on any change in behavior that you had exhibited, we wanted to see if those would actually affect people's behavior and explore sort of differential impacts across different sectors of the MIT community. So what we did is we took 2,000 of the most frequent parkers on campus, and we split them into 4 groups. One group got these weekly commuter digests, as we call them. Another group got cash incentives, third group got a combination. So they'd get these informational emails, and they'd also be given cash that went right onto their ID card that could be spent across campus. And then the fourth group was our control. So this is an example of the Commuter Digest emails that we sent out with sort of interesting fun facts and appeals to social norms and behavior around how people are getting around campus. And so that's an example of the informational side. On the financial side, we gave people rewards based on the delta, based on the change in behavior that they exhibited. So if they were a 5-day-a-week driver and they shifted to, say, 4 or 3 days a week, they would actually benefit as much as a 2-day-a-week driver stopping driving at all. So it's obviously not quite as fair in that if you're a every-day-a-week driver and you park 0 days that next week, you get a big cash just lump sum on your card because for just a few weeks. But we wanted to really target everyone. And so the findings. The first thing I'll say, nudging is hard. Like many of the studies out there that have done things like this, we did not see a statistically significant finding across the groups. But, combing through the data, you're looking to see some kernels of interesting stuff. And one of the things that was really interesting is that the top performing participants, and this was statistically significant, was they tended to be in that third group, the combination of info and rewards, in that people were interested in our emails and what we were telling them about their opportunities to change their commuting modes. But they also needed that bit of a nudge to actually open our emails and read them and to think about this stuff. And these little cash rewards that we were giving seemed to be enough to do that. And it was fascinating how even senior professors who could easily afford to park on campus, the prospect of them getting that free cup of coffee with that reward we were giving them, from a lot of our survey results, they said, you know what, that was enough to get me to rethink this. And again, coming back to this whole idea of human irrationality around decision making, it's fascinating how we deal with money in different buckets, right? You've got your lunch bucket, your coffee bucket, your commuting costs bucket, and when you start to blend those together, it creates a really interesting opportunity for rethinking your behavior and rethinking your expenditures. I will say this though, a caution in terms of surveys versus passive data. So, I looked at the passive data and I was a little disappointed that, I didn't see a huge shift in behavior looking at the actual parking and transit usage. But when I looked at the survey data, that was really exciting. It said that there was a real change. And it really spoke to the point that, when we look at surveys, there's always going to be a bias. And we know this. We've studied this in all our courses on survey design if you've taken those kind of classes. But this really drives home that point, that people who are shifting their behavior and want to tell you a good story, they will respond to the surveys. Those that aren't necessarily lying, but they want to tell themselves that they are behaving more sustainably than they actually are, will kind of skew the results a little bit. And so, when you're reading all those studies out there in the literature that just rely on survey data, it's just important to kind of keep that with a grain of salt. Because if I had published this with just a survey result, I think it would have painted a much rosier picture than the one that we published with both the passive and the survey data being a part of the story. So let's talk about some takeaways here. The first thing to mention is classical economics are really fundamental here. What I mean by that is, as much as these books about nudges and behavioral science and the way we can appeal to psychology and things like that, as much as they're important, you need to get the fundamental pricing right. If transit is too expensive, if we keep jacking up metro prices in Toronto, and parking is too cheap, no matter what you do, that's going to still impact behavior. And so you need to really get the pricing right. But behavioral science, the behavioral economics, the irrationality of how we think of salience in terms of pricing, that really does play a role too. And our study looking at, and I should say this changes at MIT were not a pilot project. They are a permanent shift that we did to commuting benefits there. Those have an impact. This whole pay-as-you-park pricing thing, this relies on the fact that a $10 a day cost every single day compared to an annual fee with the exact same amount of money is going to have a different behavioral impact. So we need to really think about this in a way that we don't right now. And so I talk about nudging the nudgers as well. So in terms of institutional politics, getting university administrators or employer facility managers or transit agency executives to start thinking about the economics of this and the possible benefits of rethinking how we provide incentives for people to commute is really important. And so telling stories like this I think is useful to show that, you know what, it wasn't so scary, even if it cost MIT a little more money, and which it's not, but even if it were, the benefits from a carbon footprint perspective, from an employee satisfaction perspective, they're all sort of a win-win. And so the story is a difficult one to sell because of the emotion around parking policy, but I think it's a really exciting story. So finally, when it comes to motivating the stakeholders, I think it's useful to come back to what are we actually trying to do here. And so the traveler, the everyday commuter, we're trying to overcome here the tragedy of the commons. That, you know, we all want our free open road space, but when we all travel on it doesn't work for us anymore. So if we can internalize those externalities of congestion and the idea that if we don't pay for our way through our transportation system, then we will overuse it, these sort of things, that's really important. On the employer perspective, again, we need to show that the economics work out for them. Because no matter how nice a PR story this is, if it's going to cost them a lot of money, they're not going to do it. But when you look at the cost of parking in every city, no matter where you're looking at, it tends to be that people underestimate the cost of providing parking and overestimate the cost of providing things like transit subsidies or bike parking and these sorts of things. And you need to show that employees actually want it. Show that people that would change their commuting modes if they had better benefits would actually do so. On the transit agency, as a public agency, they are risk averse. Super important to recognize that they're not going to want to take a big gamble if the head of the agency's name is going to be in the papers that next year because they agreed to some agreement that is ending up losing them a lot of revenue. Things like monthly passes are a very important revenue source for transit agencies because they're predictable. So for the MBTA, I think it was 55% of those pass sales are through employers. And I don't know what the stat is in Toronto, but I'm sure it's pretty high as well in terms of people that are buying passes because of their work benefits or things like that. And it's a third of their revenue. So the second you start touching that, there could be a real threat to their bottom line. And so it's important to build relationships with the transit agencies if you're looking to try and create some of these changes. And finally, the government, looking at the broader perspective here, we need to create incentives for this to work. And so things like tax credits. I know, as I mentioned, we don't have this tax credit in Canada anymore for our transit passes, but there are interesting credits in the States that you can pay for your transit benefits with pre-tax dollars. Though, on the other hand, you can also pay for your parking benefits with pre-tax dollars, which has a more negative impact on changing your SOV mode share than transit benefits. So, interesting regulatory environment, but we have to be thinking about this when it comes to creating change. And finally, on regulatory tools. Transportation solutions are often land use solutions, and so when it comes to zoning policies, creating zoning rules that lower the minimum parking or eliminate parking minimums and replace them with parking maximums. The idea that when you're building a house near a subway station, it doesn't need as many parking spaces or any as you would in another area. The City of Cambridge has a PTDM, or Parking and Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, where they actually require employers to take surveys of their employees and to take steps to reduce their employee SOV mode share on a yearly basis. They're one of the only cities that has something like that, but I think it's a fantastic piece of legislation, if anything, just because it creates the data out there. Like, it forces employers to actually ask people, how are you getting to work? And they mandate a 50% sample size. So then for researchers, like many of you in the room, you can then look at, okay, how are people getting to work from employers in downtown versus the suburbs? And what incentives are each employer doing to try and change this? And if there's a regulatory impetus to do so, it can be even more important. And so I mentioned sort of the local scene because I was reading in the Globe yesterday, there's an article, the TDSB is a lesson on the high cost of free parking. And so Donald Shoup, I want you to remember that name, because the high cost of free parking is this idea that there's no such thing as free parking. We all pay for it in some way or another, whether it's through the rents that you're paying for your home or the prices of the goods in the mall that you're going to that had to build too much parking than they actually needed. There's interesting issues there. So the idea here is we need to be thinking about what we can do to try and manage our transportation demand as opposed to just increasing supply, assuming that behavior is fixed and sort of handed down. Behavior is malleable, and we can do things to actually shift it in a way that we want to. And so, we are at this crossroads, and I think it's important to look at how the world of new technology advancements is going to improve things, hopefully, or hopefully not deteriorate. But at the end of the day, we need to remember that we're a society of human beings that have certain irrationalities, but as Dan Ariely's book said in his title, it's predictable irrationalities. So if we can design policies and build infrastructure that makes the most benefit from the fact that we are human, and we can achieve solutions like what we did at MIT around reducing parking demand 10% with a few easy solutions like that, I think it'll be a lot better going forward in the future. And that's all I got. Thank you. Questions? All right.
That was a really awesome presentation. Thank you. Question about so whenever we talk about shifting from auto modes to transit in Toronto, the counter argument that always comes up is that many parts of our transit system are already so congested that there's a lot of debate as to what can handle the new volume and where, right? So this came into the King Street pilot project and plenty of other things that have been happening recently. So how different is the situation in Cambridge, where all of these, so many MIT employees were, it was a documented shift from SOBs to public transit. How did the transit system in Cambridge handle that, and what were kind of the issues there, if you can speak to that at all?
It's a great question. It's a really important one because, yes, just as our roadway space is fixed, often, at least in the short term, our transit capacity is fixed. Yeah. And so the MBTA Red Line, it's one of the subway lines that goes through Cambridge and serves the MIT campus, is already really running at capacity. Their headways are quite limited because of various technology constraints right now. And so, yeah, there was a lot of concern that could the MBTA actually handle this new demand? And so it speaks to the importance of planning this not in a vacuum, that employers do one thing and transit agencies do another. We need to be talking about this collectively, because when you shift people onto transit, it means you should be investing more in that transit. And if you don't, it ends up as a negative cycle where ridership declines and then people stop using it, and then they lower they increase the headways on your service and it becomes less attractive. But that positive cycle can also happen the other way. And so as we see bus ridership increase on a few of the bus routes that go to campus, the MBTA has been talking about increasing the service on those routes, because the best case to do that is when the ridership is already there. But from the perspective of transportation demand management, there's a whole world of TDM within the transit world as well. It's shifting behavior, not just from mode to mode, but even within a mode, across times or across routes. So I know Hong Kong, for example, they have a fare structure where they will give I think it's some sort of like fare reduction if you get in before a certain time. And there's other cities around the world that do that to try and shift transit demand. And I think it's a great problem to have when your transit systems are at capacity. It means that people are using the system. But just as behavior is not fixed when it comes to mode share, it's not fixed when it comes to what time of day you're traveling, what routes you're taking. And we can shift those as well. And Transport for London's been doing some interesting stuff there. They put signs in their tube stations showing exactly what time of day that station tends to be busiest, and suggesting for, say, tourists who don't know the patterns there to consider using alternate stations, say walking to another station, or shifting their patterns a little bit. But it's a really important issue that needs to be talked about.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering if you have considered or started looking at, from a broader perspective, how different would the results be, because the study group is academia and perhaps educated, higher income people perhaps. How would this change, or these findings would change if it was to be implemented on the region, or if you have perhaps assessed differences between your study group and the population overall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another great point. So I didn't actually show a demographic breakdown of the employees at MIT. Of those 11,000 people, but 1,000 of them are faculty. The rest, a number of them are research staff and non-faculty academic kind of staff. But a lot of them are not. They're administrative assistants. They're like caretaking staff. There's all the people that make an institution work, and that's a big chunk of the population of people that work there, just like at U of T or any other institution. And so, yeah, I didn't show it here, but we looked at some of those aspects, and of the people that changed, who actually shifted behavior. And not too surprisingly, the people that were taking transit more were those that lived closer to transit lines, and those that lived on lines that required fewer transfers. So there's a whole big area of Boston in the south end that is a lower income area, And so we don't know people's incomes in my study, but we could use proxies based on where they lived. And a lot of those people shifted behavior and drove less and started taking that transit line more. In another area, a more high-income area that's less connected to transit, or is, but it requires a couple more transfers, we saw a much lower shift. And so, we talked about in Professor Shalaby's course around transit, like the transfer penalty, how much less people are likely to take even a good transit service if you have that uncertainty of taking 1 or 2 transfers. And that has a huge impact. So it just speaks to the importance of connecting our networks in a way that we aren't necessarily doing right now. But yeah, further research could be done on that perspective too, because I think our findings are definitely applicable to any sort of workplace. Like, there's nothing magical or special about MIT in that sense. Like, it's just a workplace with people across the spectrums of education, income, geographic boundaries. But it takes more of these studies to see whether this would hold in other environments.
Yeah, I guess especially because I guess the bulk of people is younger people, right? Like, I would say majority of the study group is younger people that's studying.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at students, right? So postdocs were included, so you're gonna have those. But otherwise, the age distribution more or less matches the society. It's not aged. It's skewed low. Okay. Question over here.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm curious as to if you've given any thought as to how applying a project like this on a larger scale would work. Because you made a really good point on the MBTA or any transit agency's reliance on metro passes, but a big, at least my perspective on this, is a big reason that this worked so well is that the MBTA allowed you to do a sort of smart card style where you're only billed per trip. Mm-hmm. And so my instinct is that this only works if you have like a select group of employers or institutions or whatever doing this, but I'm not sure how it would pan out on a larger scale. And obviously you've done a lot more work on this, so I'm curious as to what your take is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. That is certainly a limitation. If you don't do what was done here, it can be harder to make that sell to employers that it's worth doing this. But even having employers subsidize transit passes, just like monthly passes, regular passes, to employees that want them. If they're subsidizing at 30%, increase it to 50 or increase it to 80% or whatever for monthly passes. Just doing that for the regular transit riders is a huge benefit to them. And so, there's no one size fits all here, and every employer is going to have a different arrangement. Every transit agency, depending on their fare structure, will have a different arrangement. I mean, places like, I'll come back to London, where they do fare capping, where, you tap your card eventually. If you hit the weekly or monthly or whatever it is price, you'll stop paying. There it's easier, because everyone is in that system. It's here where right now, you have to be locked into this monthly pass, where it's a little limited. But we've got our Presto card here now. These are things that we could hopefully see down the line where we do things like that. But that's a really important point you bring up.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering, did you do any research on commuting distance and how it can relate? So looking at longer distance commuters, people who are coming from the suburbs, because I did see some shift away from active transportation, which would indicate shorter trips moving towards transit. Mm-hmm. But how would that change for longer distances?
Yeah, from what I'm remembering, it's all a bit of a blur now, but certainly the shorter trips where there is transit, but people didn't want to pay that $250 or whatever it was, and now we're taking those trips. There's a lot of shift there. For the longer trips, a lot of these people are, we talked about demographics and lower income people that can't afford to live as close to transit, and they're often less connected to the transit system. I believe there was a correlation between, longer trips were less likely to then switch over to transit. Because also the commuter rail services in Boston aren't, let's just say it's no-go transit. Like, let's appreciate what we have here. It's a limited service, and it's not super well connected like it is in other cities. So those that were living farther away tended to shift less than people who live closer. I guess that was the main takeaway there.
As everybody said, great presentation. I'm going to take my question is going to go completely orthogonal to everything you said here, except you talked a couple times about carpooling, and the carpooling is in decline, at least in the States. I think it's the same here. And you're working in sort of autonomous vehicle thing now. So what are the implications of that for all the ride sharing that we're talking about? I mean, everybody says autonomous vehicles will only make things better. Everybody ride shares. And like many things, I get a little skeptical about things. I don't see a lot of ride sharing going on in the general population. Will people, I guess the question is anything about traditional carpooling programs, which of course are different, telling us about people's propensity perhaps to ride share. And obviously the new apps and things make it easier to ride share, etc. Do you have any insight or anything at MIT that's going on that might comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and there's a lot of research in that space, and so much beyond my thesis, but some of my colleagues with Professor Zhao are looking at that very aspect from a behavioral perspective, and that, Uber and Lyft, what they're trying to do with matching people compared to old dial-a-ride services that were created decades ago. The fundamentals, a lot of this, isn't new. It's still getting people to be in the same backseat of a car. It's a very different social environment than sharing a bus in terms of the intimacy of that and the barriers that might exist from various personal comfort, safety, security reasons, and just the logistics of it. Trying to get people matched to where they want to go. So I think there's a lot of potential with the new technology to encourage more ride sharing. Though there's been a lot of discussion at the TRB conference last couple weeks ago. There were some really interesting talks about how much that whole sharing thing has been overhyped in terms of what it can take traffic off the road. So a report from Bruce Schaller, who was one of the traffic heads of policy in New York City, found a real huge increase in vehicle kilometers traveled from people switching into ride-hailing compared to if they hadn't been using those trips in those modes. And even when they do it shared, it was still almost as big an increase. And the reason being, those trips were coming from mostly public transit, not people's private vehicles. So we really need to realize, when I've seen ads on the subway here, Lyft saying, a ride shared is an emission halved. That's not true, not in the slightest, right? Those are rides that would have otherwise almost always been taken by transit. And so I think there's definitely a potential for connected and autonomous vehicles to change that calculus, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, it's a geometry problem. How do we move the most people in the least amount of space without congesting our streets? And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and I think understanding the limitations of apps like the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. There's some interesting developments on the carpool front, where people say at MIT those that want to carpool, they would, but it's hard to do cost splitting and everything, and finding someone on a day-to-day basis. Our carpool policies were pretty archaic in that you had to basically sign up with a single carpooler for the whole year, and you could split your parking pass or whatever. But it was not very flexible, and people, if they didn't carpool every day, and they both had to come in, they were actually breaking the rules and have their parking permits revoked. But to me, that's ridiculous. But we want to allow people to carpool sometimes, even if they're driving alone other times. So we've been looking at, there's a bunch of vendors out there now that have apps where you can do the sort of dynamic carpooling and find employees that are working in your same office or company who you might be more comfortable sharing a ride with, and then splitting the costs automatically through this app. And it's not like an Uber Lyft thing because they limit it at the cost of a break-even, so no one's actually making money. Waze Carpool, if anyone's seen that, they're now doing that, which is an interesting venture they're getting into. So yeah, I think the tech can help with this, but it's going to be a tough nut to crack.
Another question I have another question, just a real techie thing. It's the Charlie card in UT-ITE, right?
Yeah.
But you said that, if I heard you say that, with the subsidy, people could be using their MIT card to pay for transit.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there an integration where you can actually use your MIT card to tap into a subway station?
Yeah, so it was interesting actually. Many years ago, like a couple decades ago, or no, I guess maybe whenever the Charlie card was implemented, was a decade ago or whatever. One of my professors, Fred Salvucci, who used to be Secretary of Transportation in Massachusetts back in the day, he was really pushing for the policies that we talked about. And everyone said, oh, you can't put it in the past, and the technology wouldn't even work. This is so complex, the agency can barely keep the trains running. What are we talking about? And what he did is he took the MIT ID card, he took a Charlie card, an elastic band, put them together, and said, okay, here's your pass. And it works fine, of course. And so, and you just show, okay, if we take that RFID or whatever chip it is, and they put it on the pass or on the ID card, and it works fine. And MBTA said, yeah, you can go do that.
So it's a Charlie card, RFID
On your employee ID card. And students have that too. I didn't mention the student policies at MIT, but students are subsidized transit passes at, and they can get a 50% subsidy, and they have to buy their own pass, but they can also just use their ID card as a paper use. They can put money on it, and it's got 2 chips on it, one for MIT, like doors and stuff, and then another for transit. So the technology is not hard. That's like the least of the barriers here.
You mentioned RCTs are running your research. I just wonder how to control the selection files in such system. And in actually, RCT is difficult in the survey, so such as email survey or online survey how to control this part.
Of selection bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, RCTs are the gold standard when they're done right. But if you are doing a sort of opt-in sort of study, you're going to really have a lot of this selection bias issue. We were lucky in that with some careful negotiation, we had an opt-out system. So those 2,000 people were, it was a little more than 2,000 that we actually had them like enrolled in this, like we were basically email blasting them, but with the blessing of MIT administration. So there was no opt-in, it was an opt-out. I never emailed like to say, I don't want to be part of this. And there was a bit of that, it may be 3%. So we had a 97% retention rate, compared to if you do an opt-in, where maybe you get, I don't know, 20, 30%, you're going to have a much bigger sampling bias there. So I know that's not possible in a broader public kind of realm where you're doing research, but if you can ever set up something where there's more of an opt-out versus opt-in, and the privacy and spamming laws or whatever are still obeyed, you can do a lot more rigorous research there. So, short answer, I was lucky. Other thoughts, questions, concerns?
No? Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we thank Adam for a great presentation. Thanks, everyone.